Going from I want to work with this business to either source from them or sell to them to I am ready to trade with them, it's a very long, manual, and unclear process. And that entire process introduces drop-off. It introduces operational overhead on both sides of the relationship. And it's very unclear what the true data-driven risk profiles of either party are.
Hello, and welcome to Speaking of Supply Chain, where we explore trends, current events, and innovations impacting the logistics and supply chain industries. I'm your host, Ellen Wood. In today's global economy, one tariff can shift entire supply chains overnight. If you're responsible for operational resilience, procurement strategy, or supplier performance, this conversation is for you. We're diving into how companies are rethinking sourcing strategies, validating vendors at lightning speed, and building trust in a world where agility isn't optional, it's essential. Our guest today is Sid Malladi, CEO and founder of Nuvo, a platform that's changing the game for modern supply chain resilience. Welcome, Sid.
Thanks for having me, Ellen.
Great to have you on. Let's get to our icebreaker really quick for today. And our question is, what is the most interesting thing most people don't know about you?
Well, I'm not sure if this is most interesting, but certainly a fun fact about myself is that I have gone down deep rabbit holes in the art of cartography. And I have plastered various forms of maps of the world and various geographies throughout my home. I like digging into, the world as it's organized by political lines, topographic lines, and in many other ways. So I'll just spend time to decompress, staring into those maps and kind of absorbing the composition of the world that is around us. And that's I guess, a unique way that I like to spend on my downtime.
That is interesting. I was actually at an antique mall about 2 weeks ago, and they had a really, really old globe, and it was cool to look at the older, countries and lines and divisions, and the way the world looked then at the time. I myself, my kids have a globe that's almost as old as I am. So it's not a new one. And they laugh at it a little bit. They're like, that's not the name of that country anymore. I'm like, no, that's what happens. That's why you need to learn history.
That's funny. Have you looked into getting one of those like 3D globes that kind of have the peaks and troughs with the mountains and the valleys across the world? Those are fun to kind of spin around.
I mean, the one I have has a little bit of topography on it, a little bit of like relief, but not much. It's not one of it, like it's not to scale, certainly. So I'm trying to think the most interesting thing most people don't know about me. So I've talked about some of my career, early career. I've had a varied career path. I've done many things. And one thing that I've talked about is my scuba diving career. I was a scuba diving instructor for a while, which is an odd thing to be in Indiana. But before that, I actually started as a lifeguard and swim instructor. And we're getting into summer. We've got the heat wave going right now. And I keep thinking about it. And I'm talking to my 16-year-old. I'm like, go get your lifeguarding certificate. You will have jobs. You will have some teenage job security if you have some sort of certification. So that's been on my mind recently. And it's a pretty interesting fact that most people don't know about me. I cannot sit next to a pool and relax. I am watching everything all the time on alert.
That's really cool. If I may recommend, I got my PADI open water certification a few years ago, and I've really enjoyed going on dives in the Monterey Bay area in California. So if you ever find yourself out there, they have some really good, underwater kind of topography. I wouldn't go so far as to say corals or anything to explore, but a very diverse, very diverse set of sights to see down there. I did have a mini shark encounter, which I think was my favorite, most memorable underwater diving experience. But certainly a very different world down there.
Yeah, it's a very diverse ecosystem down there. I have not been to that area, but I also saw an 8-foot nurse shark on my first open water dive in the ocean, and that was pretty exciting for 14-year-old me.
Oh, I'm sure you freaked out. Hope you had a dive knife on you. That
No, actually, I didn't. Okay, this might be the most interesting thing people don't know about me then. So I was diving with my father, and we were in the Bahamas in Freeport and at Unexo, and we were diving, and we got off the boat, and he was my dive buddy, and he had one of those. This was a long time ago, almost 30 years ago. So it was a camera casing that you put one of the disposable cameras in, and then it was just a waterproof casing that you could take down there, and it was the shark was on the ground between two coral heads that were, I don't know, 6 feet tall. And it was just laying there. It's a nurse shark. They don't do anything. They can only open their mouths 2 inches. It's not a scary shark. And I messaged my dad. I was like, Dad, go down and take a picture. And so he's at the top and he takes a picture. And I said, no, go down. And he said, no. I said, give me a camera. He wouldn't let me have it. So that was a memorable experience, but clear that I was more adventurous underwater than he was. I was ready to go after the wildlife, and he was just happy to observe it from afar.
Oh, that's funny. You're definitely at your bravest on your first go around at it.
Yes. But we're not talking about scuba diving today. We are going to be talking about trust in procurement. And this is so big a topic right now with all of the changes that are taking place politically around the globe, but especially in the Americas right now, when we're dealing with these tariffs, and it's causing all kinds of disruption, and suppliers are questioning what they're going to do, how they're going to get around it, how they're going to manage their business when they have to pivot so frequently based on whatever the administration has decided is going to go through, or whatever is, currently in discussions. So how have some of these recent trade policies either accelerated the need for companies to rethink their sourcing, or can you walk us how you're helping them transition from some of these? I mean, it is really reactionary the way that they're having to do this into a more strategic sourcing, even though we know that they're going to have to react.
Yeah. So maybe taking a step back, I think to put ourselves into the shoes of a lot of these operators in the supply chain world, what most people find interesting or surprising about how businesses in the supply chain work are that for every given business, the nature of trade partnerships with your vendors, suppliers, and also your customers on the other side of the supply chain, these are very direct trade partnerships that don't have any intermediaries. So unlike the consumer commerce environment where people are buying a lot of things on marketplaces or they're putting a lot of their spend on credit cards, you essentially have these middlemen that serve as trust brokers to allow for both sides of the equation to kind of scale how many vendors or customers you're able to transact with or partner with. In the case of B2B supply chains, that doesn't really exist. So if you're, let's say, wholesale business, you might have 100 different suppliers or brands that you procure various goods from, and you might have 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 retail customers that you sell to. And across each of these supplier and customer relationships, the business is responsible for all of the operational overhead and risk that exists on each of these relationships, right? So by virtue of, let's say, this wholesale business having thousands of supplier and customer relationships, you're responsible for onboarding them, verifying their legitimacy, understanding their fraud and credit risk, understanding financial volatility of these trade partners, recognizing how trade, patterns and activities between your business and each of your partners is shifting. Especially, the tariff regime being an example where you might start seeing cost surplus on some of these cross-border trade partners that you might be interacting with. And you're responsible for managing all of that complexity fully internally. So oftentimes what ends up happening is that the complexity and the overhead is just so high that it kind of gets you stuck. It gets you clogged up and makes it very difficult to pivot or be agile in an environment where volatility is running amok. And I view tariffs as, just one other vector of volatility. I mean, we just a couple of years ago, businesses felt volatility in a very different dimension when we had, the supply chain shocks in the advent of the pandemic. So the question becomes, how do you How do you pivot your sourcing and your revenue strategy to adapt to that? Right. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what we're seeing in the ecosystem, and how we think that technology can play a very meaningful role in powering some of this dynamism that I think is extremely critical. So in the advent of tariffs, a supplier, let's say, who sells into what they considered a stable base of customers that were ordering a predictable volume of goods from them, paying them a predictable sum of revenue. Now that supplier is asking themselves the question, for reasons that are external to them, tariffs, how is demand, price, and cost going to fluctuate against my current customers? And how do I ensure that a possible 50% drop in customer demand from existing partners that I've been working with for the last 5, 10 plus years doesn't, you know, destroy my business? Right. So that's a question that they ask. And the answer from that point of view is more is always better. You want to have more customers, more diverse customers, not just geographically, but different customer segments that you're able to ship your goods to and sell your goods to. So I think the level of stability of saying I have a predictable volume of customers who I've known on handshake agreements for the last X number of years, that no longer applies. You're always in this kind of acquisitive motion of trying to hedge your bets across as many revenue channels as possible. Now, if you flip that over to the sourcing side, very similar dynamic. A business that had been buying, $20 per unit of lumber, as an example, if that lumber suddenly becomes $30, $35, $40 because you're procuring that lumber from, Canada, is a very generic example. I think lumber is actually exempt from the tariff regime, but I just wanted to use it as an indicative example. You have your maybe general contractor jobs that have already been quoted. You've already priced those jobs. So you have a finite amount of revenue that's coming in, but then suddenly your cost basis has doubled or tripled and you don't really know what to do about it. How are these businesses thinking about, enhancing and accelerating their strategy around sourcing and procurement? Well, they're thinking about two problems. First is, in the advent of all of this volatility, will my existing vendors make it through the other side in a secure way? Or, you're starting to see a ton of supplier risk that is emerging where, if your supplier shuts down shop, your business moves at the pace of your least lucky or least competent supplier. So you want to ensure that your existing partnerships are healthy. But then you also want to make sure that you have a diversity of trade partnerships so that maybe you're sourcing some of your lumber from domestic distributors. You might want to source some lower cost lumber, but more high kind of price volatility risk lumber from like that Canadian sourcer. So having a diverse hedged strategy, I think, is like the wisest way that any business can be prepared for these sort of shifts so that you can pivot very organically whenever you need to, instead of being unprepared when a certain unpredictable shock hits.
Sure. So what are the challenges that they're facing when they're looking for these new qualified suppliers from either direction?
Yeah, so I think there are a few ways that we can break this down. First and foremost is just discovery, knowing who's out there in the market. Like who are the options that you should explore. I think there have been a variety of ways that discovery has gotten easier, faster, and cheaper today than it was before. Most businesses have some type of an online internet presence. So if you were to look up, who's selling lumber, who's selling liquor, or, whatever it is that you're trying to procure or source, you have a better shot of being able to discover, top of funnel opportunities for new trade partnerships better than you have in the past. But I think an area that we've been able to influence the most from Nuvo's point of view is once you've discovered a possible new trade partnership that you'd like to activate, going from I want to work with this business to either source from them or sell to them to I am ready to trade with them. It's a very long, manual, and unclear process in many ways. So I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say that you're you're a restaurant owner and you're trying to source your fresh vegetables from a different vendor because the one that you've partnered with so far has been prone to some kind of risk shock or their price volatility, something that doesn't work with your economics as a restaurant operator. If you find an alternative food service distributor, activating that new relationship involves you submitting new onboarding paperwork. It requires a 1 to 2 week process of that new food service distributor putting you through a rigorous due diligence process, trying to verify your legitimacy as a business because fraud rates are blowing through the roof, especially in the advent of AI. So they need to make sure that you're legitimate. They're running you through many different verification checks. They have to evaluate you for trade risk because in many of these cases, sellers are extending trade credit off their own balance sheets where they're parting ways with their goods, but getting paid for them 30, 60, 90 days later. So you want to make sure that there's good credit history associated with your counterparty. And that entire process introduces drop off. It introduces operational overhead on both sides of the relationship. And it's very unclear what the true data-driven risk profiles of either party are. So again, you're waiting 2 weeks. And once you start that relationship, that new food service distributor might say, let's see how it goes for the first 6 months. I'm not going to give you any credit. You're going to have to pay me at the time of delivery fulfillment. That's not very good for your cash flow. Maybe they cap your credit limit or your purchasing limit to an amount that is less than what your true procurement needs are, because they don't know any better about your business. So you're slow rolling this like 6 to 12 month on ramp with every new trade relationship for it to be truly activated to the extent that you need it to be. And I think the complexity and the overhead cost is something that largely prevents businesses from saying, hey, I want that N+1 trade partnership to activate, because I just don't want to deal with that complexity unless there is a forcing function that becomes existential for my business. Then I'll do whatever it takes to sweat it out and do the unglamorous work of pivoting. But the cost, I view it as a tax. The tax of a bit associated with a business pivoting their trade relationships across their supply chain relationships is so high that they don't want to do it if they can help it.
Sure. And I mean, I love your example just because I used to be a restaurant manager. And so I relate to that infinitely. But I mean, that's such a small scale. And what you're saying is absolutely factual. I mean, that's how long it takes. These are the risks that you run into. This is the slog that you have to go through to, to switch suppliers and, bring on a new vendor. But when we're talking about the economies of scale and looking at distributors and companies and enterprises, it's that much bigger an issue, because it's not a couple $1,000s in produce every week. It's millions of dollars of product that we're talking about, and that's a huge risk for these companies to take on and extend credit to. So what does this vetting process look like? You're telling me it's periodic, it's clunky, and it's manual, and obviously the digital age has changed that a little bit. So when that speed, when that reliability, when that risk mitigation all has to be balanced, what does that look like now?
Yeah, so we're just to introduce like what our long-term mission is with Nuvo. We're trying to build the digital infrastructure to power physical goods trade and really accelerate that as much as possible. So what we see ourselves as is almost this handshake layer that makes it faster, easier, cheaper for businesses to activate new trade partnerships with their suppliers and their customers in a way that couldn't have been possible in a pen and paper plus manual review era that makes connectivity very, very difficult and painful, frankly, to accomplish. So on Nuvo, let's go back to this restaurant operator working with a food service distributor example. With Nuvo, we're building this verified business identity network where once that food service distributor decides that they want to do business with Ellen's restaurant, as an example, they can send you an invitation to connect with them on the Nuvo network. And by virtue of you replacing your typical onboarding paperwork with completing your Nuvo profile and committing to sharing your Nuvo profile with that food service distributor, what the platform helps accomplish is deep sets of legitimacy verification. So are you who you say you are? And are you authoritatively, a trustworthy business? We pull in signals from many dozens of authoritative databases like government registries, the IRS, Social Security Administration, fraud databases, credit risk databases like the bureaus. We pull information from the banks to demonstrate cash flow history and health. So once you kind of put out this request that you want to be a customer with that new food service distributor, that supplier now has all of the context that they need to validate trust and activate that new trade relationship with you, in minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
much faster.
it's faster, it's easier. The levels of visibility and trust are that much higher. And as a direct consequence, like if you think about the second and third order effects of doing this, now the food service distributor is able to double their customer base without necessarily having to double their operational overhead. So they're now motivated to do more and grow their business in a way that they just didn't have the infrastructure to do before. The second order implication of that is now, as Ellen's Restaurant, you now have a greater desire to expand your trade relationships with other vendors and suppliers. And instead of maybe only having the capacity to have 5 food suppliers that you're procuring from, now maybe you have 25, right? You have greater optionality. You're able to purchase, fresh Italian food ingredients from a specialty Italian food service vendor. You're able to get the best fresh produce from someone who specializes in that. And you're able to kind of stock up on inventory that differentiates you as a business and a restaurant operator, because you might be able to expand the items on your menu. There's so many ways that you can think about how this is advantageous to your business. And beyond that, you now have more choice around which suppliers are most cost competitive. Where do you want to buy certain supplies from? Maybe you don't kind of put all your eggs in one basket. And you can start to run these optimization functions. And the next time you want to partner with that next food service distributor, you can reuse your Nuvo profile to build that next connection. Instead of having to yet again fill out onboarding paperwork, yet again go through a 2-week-long due diligence process, it's kind of like a trust profile that follows you as you do more and more across your trade network. And that next supplier can see that, okay, you're a vetted participant in the Nuvo network. You've partnered with other vendors and suppliers in the past and built healthy trade relationships with them. So they're going to be that much faster and more confident in activating that new relationship. So the larger the pool of participants on Nuvo's trade network becomes, the more each participant benefits over time, because we're making it progressively easier, faster, and higher trust to activate that next relationship on our platform.
So it sounds like Nuvo's just the concierge that just brings everybody together and says, okay, this is my friend. They're great. This is the other guy. They're great. You guys talk, do your thing. But so what does that look like when we're looking at across borders? Like right now we're talking about tariffs, and we know that some of these things are completely out of the suppliers or the vendors' control. When they're looking for that diversification in their supplier portfolio, are they able to look into different geographies? Are they able to look at, maybe this one is going to have, a tariff implication, this one is not, or this one's going to be able to deliver in 3 days because of their proximity, whereas this one will take 7 to 10. What are some of those? How does that work within the Nuvo platform?
Yeah, so that all happens at the discovery layer. So Nuvo doesn't really power discovery of new, supplier or customer relationships, but post discovery, when you've decided that you do want to partner with the business, we make it that much easier to actually activate that intention. So going back to your example, we do support the cross-border use case, by the way, but just to give you a worked example of why cross-border starts to increase complexity even further, if you're doing business with someone domestically, maybe you establish a standard operating procedure internally saying, here's how we're going to verify our trade partners. We're going to go to a government registry, maybe check a Secretary of State report, go and pull a credit bureau file, maybe conduct a certain due diligence process that's enforceable in the US. And you have a predictable process around saying, I want to, activate that next trade relationship, but using the same process that I've activated my previous trade relationship. But now the moment you move cross-border, you're now comparing apples and oranges. The way that
the governance is different.
It's completely different. The way that you validate a business internationally, let's say in Brazil, is not the same way that you would validate a trade partner who's down the street domestically in the US, right? So you have to run through a completely new set of validations, verifications, fraud mitigations, risk checks, to essentially model out what needs to happen in order for us to be able to buy from or sell to this cross-border business. And that's, again, high complexity, high operational overhead. And we've already established that even in the purely domestic scenario, the complexity and overhead scales linearly or super linearly with every new trade relationship that you want to activate. The moment you start going cross-border, it's not only that you go from having 5 customers to 10 customers, you're going from 5 customers to 10 customers, but from 1 country to 4 countries, you've quadrupled the level of complexity that you've had to kind of run through your diligence check process. And you find it very difficult to benchmark and compare. So one of the areas that we're driving impact is by creating a standardization layer on every profile that businesses create. So it doesn't matter if you're in Brazil or in the US, Nuvo will connect to the authoritative government registries, the bank accounts, the credit bureau scores, etc. And for someone in the US to look at a trade partner domestically versus internationally on Nuvo, we kind of reduce the variance and complexity associated with the variance in that process and say, hey, we actually make it closer to doing an apples to apples analysis on who you want to buy from or sell to, because the underlying complexity has been kind of abstracted away by the power of technology on our platform. And I think that's an area where we're spending a lot of time digging into and investing in, because we see an opportunity where if you didn't really have to think about what is the incremental complexity of doing business with someone in Mexico or doing business with someone in Canada or doing business with someone in Brazil, it was just taken care of for you, then you can focus on the business value of what are the products that I'm selling and the relationships that I'm nurturing. Today, you have to worry about products that you sell and buy, relationships that you nurture, and 80% of all of the kind of operational headache associated with those business decisions, which dilute those business decisions because you want to reduce the overhead in the first place, right? So it's give businesses back the time and the creativity to design their own destinies and let the complexity kind of fade away. That's the dream state.
Well, and I have to think that with this type of situation where you can reduce that time, where you can be looking at these suppliers in a more neutral format or across the board, you're looking at the same things and you're able to make some very quick decisions, that builds agility into the conversation. So as you said, this process used to take a lot more time. It used to take a lot more effort. And we know that when it comes to things like tariffs, they may be there now, but they might not be there in 4 years. These things come and go very quickly as governments change, as politicians change tactics in the middle of their, of their sentence, in the middle of their reign. And so having that agility has got to be a huge differentiator to say, yes, this is the case now. This is my situation now. But in 2 months, when this might change, or, they might negotiate a new deal on this particular tariff, then I can maybe go back to my original vendor, or I can go back to another vendor that would have been excluded. I think that agility is going to help them with their operational execution. Is that accurate? Is that what you're seeing?
Absolutely. Yeah. So having more connections between more businesses is a good thing because it essentially extends you optionality as a business owner, right? And I think more optionality around designing your strategy for growth under certain constraints and circumstances gives you more degrees of freedom. If a certain, you know, if and I don't I view tariffs as like, it's not it causes risk and shock, but it also opens up opportunity, right? Like another country that, maybe you wanted to ship your mangoes to before, but they were subject to 200% tariffs. If there's a new trade deal that gets done and that 200% tariff becomes a 10% import tax, you'd be selling your mangoes in that country.
Yeah.
It
works both ways.
It works both ways. Yeah. So using it as a driver to quickly action on new opportunities that emerge and arise and pull back when risks outweigh the benefit. It does work both ways, but kind of keeping those options open, having visibility into what the economics will be like under various different tariff regimes and being able to, competitively react. I mean, like the other topic on supply chains is just like, it's a heavily competitive environment, especially in the commodities markets. You think about like food, beverage, construction, building materials, other commodities, just like, steel, rubber,
aluminum.
Yeah. I mean, I think steel came up as like a pretty recent example of making big efforts to insource US steel production. These are cutthroat competitive markets where your ability to move faster than the competition allows you to capitalize on opportunities and use that as leverage to drive growth. So I view this as like how much can we tighten feedback loops? And if you think about, the businesses of the economy that have really generated outsized profits and returns, think about like high frequency trading companies on Wall Street. They have these algorithms that are looking at real-time changes in the data and committing buy and sell trades in the stock market. And that's primarily how they earn all their profit, not necessarily by an analyst sitting there kind of reacting to changes over a multi-week long period, because by that point, the market has already shifted and it's been done, right? And supply chains are like the polar opposite of that currently as it stands, because so much of this is not like tight feedback loops driven. It's not data and technology driven, where if a new change occurs, it's like, okay, there's certain period of panic, a little period of shock, then, reports start coming out, then reports start getting translated into boardroom strategy conversations. Those need to trickle down into the actual operational changes that are made. And that can take many months. And in the meantime,
it's turning the Titanic.
Yeah, exactly. So I think tightening of these feedback loops is extremely important, not just to generate like great, outcomes for these individual businesses from like a revenue growth or profitability perspective, but imagine what that means for the broader economy and like even the consumer landscape, right? Like you don't necessarily need to see PPE at the time of peak COVID go from like 50 cents a mask to $25 a mask because, the supply chains were not able to react adequately quickly enough. And now everybody feels gouged. Nobody feels very good about it. But ultimately it's like market economics. It makes sense. But how do you not allow that to happen or, avoid that to the best extent possible? I think it's a worthy question that affects everyone's daily lives.
Yeah. Now that we've seen it happen, we've all lived through it. And it's not a question of if, it's when. When are we going to experience that kind of disruption again? And it doesn't have to be a pandemic, but something that is that disruptive and that influential on the way that we operate in supply chain. So where do you see it? I mean, we've talked about, of course, trade policy and tariffs. That's on everyone's mind at the moment, so it's topical. But what are some of those supplier engagements going to look like in the future? I mean, you're talking about making it easier just to make the connection in the first place and build that initial trust. But in that world where you can make a decision very quickly and move on to the next supplier, that doesn't feel like a great supplier relationship. So what's really going to be building those relationships that are more lasting or more mutually beneficial in the long run as opposed to just transactional?
Yeah, the nature of B2B relationships, they are fundamentally relationship driven. I don't think we're going to create a world that becomes transactional whatsoever. If you think about it, what does expansion of trade partnerships enable? From a very fundamental questioning perspective, by increasing the number of vendors and suppliers that you work with, you're able to expand the total pool of goods and services that are accessible to your business to procure. And that will enable you to create better products and services that you can sell to your end customers, right? Like today, for example, if you wanted to start a hardware company, you have access to globally diverse supply chains. You can get chips from one place, screens from another place, actuators from a different place. Like to start to build a robot or, mass produce robots today, let's say even in the US, it's easier than it was, maybe 30 or 40 years ago when the total pool of suppliers that you could tap into was more limited. That constrained what you could do as a business in terms of the goods and services you could create. So I think what will happen is that we will start to dramatically increase the quantity, quality, and variety of goods and services that are available in the global economy by virtue of expanding supplier and vendor relationships. And on the flip side, by virtue of having access to globally accessible customers that buy your products, there are two benefits. The most easy and obvious one is that you have new vectors to drive growth in your business. You don't need to sell your avocados only within some small corner territory of California. You can ship your avocados to Asia and, explore new business growth opportunities that would have otherwise been difficult to accomplish if two businesses on either side of the world were not able to connect and activate their relationship with each other. But if you think about what is the implication of being able to have a globally accessible set of customers that you could sell into, I think the second order implications are even more interesting because it will allow you to create and distribute goods and services that are more specialized and niche. Whereas maybe there wasn't a sufficient market for, a special type of spicy avocado that you had concocted with your own creativity, because within your kind of regional constraints, there weren't enough buyers for it. But if you have a globally accessible customer base, maybe there's an interesting enough niche market where this product exists and can thrive in this new world, right? So it's really interesting to think about how we can get increasingly and progressively specialized in our global supply chains, where we'll see an explosion of available goods and services, deeper personalization of whatever it is that you want or you need. You don't need to go and get that generic part. You have a more specialized part that is accessible somewhere at a cost-effective price point for you to procure and use to build whatever it is that you're going to build and pass through in the next level down of the supply chain. I think that's a very interesting world, and it's far, far from being one that is purely transactional. I think there will be more like a higher volume of deep relationships instead of kind of a higher volume of progressively more shallow relationships.
Okay. So which types of companies, and I'll use the word companies very loosely because they could be on either side of this equation for you. So we've either got a supplier or we've got a consumer, and maybe I don't even know, perhaps a company could be on both sides of that, depending on what it is that they're doing. If they're taking a product, making something, and then selling it to someone else, they could potentially be on both sides of that equation. But what companies are really making the most use and getting the most value out of this platform? What industries are they in? What size? Which customers, which listeners of mine should be most interested in your platform?
Yeah. Well, if you're a business that is selling B2B physical goods to a high volume of customers, onboarding a high volume of them every single year, exploring new channels for growth like e-commerce channels and digital storefronts to acquire new customers, and you have an existing customer onboarding and perhaps a credit process in place, then Nuvo is something that you should absolutely explore. We've successfully partnered with businesses across a variety of industries like food and beverage. If you're, a liquor wholesaler selling to, 5,000 bars, bodegas, restaurants, and small retail stores, you need to have a scaled customer onboarding and risk management process in place where you can scale your efforts using the introduction of better technology to drive that process. If you're selling building materials or construction products to, many thousands of general contractors who are also businesses that are trading goods with you, then you also need a scaled onboarding and risk management process. So those are just some examples of industries where we've gotten really strong market pull. But, we also work across, steel, glass, auto parts, tires, medical equipment, the variety of products and subcategories of goods moving through the supply chain is large and diverse. And as long as you're doing business with a high enough volume of trade partners and you're trying to expand your pool of trade partners that you're selling into or buying from, Nuvo would be a good fit to help you scale those trade relationships in time.
All right. So I'm gonna take this back to our to our icebreaker. What is the most interesting product that you have seen a supplier bring to your platform?
The most interesting product that a supplier has brought. That's an interesting question.
Because we've talked about building materials, we've talked about food, we talked about some perhaps niche food ingredients or anything like that. We've talked about medical PPE and medical devices. I'm trying to think. There's got to be something bizarre that you've seen walk through the door.
It's not necessarily maybe it's not bizarre, but one of the areas where I was like, wow, this is really cool is we've been seeing a lot of solar product moving through the Nuvo ecosystem, where some of the largest solar panel manufacturing and distribution businesses are on our platform working with solar installers. One of the really cool things about this is that it allows us to visualize the changing and evolving nature of the supply chain world, where 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there are not very many solar installers in the US economy. Right. There are a lot today.
Thousands.
Growing every single month. So to be able to visualize the growth of solar like wholesale buyers and the explosion of net new demand for, sustainable energy technologies to flow through the supply chain, it's one of those like exponentially accelerating end markets where, maybe other markets are like relatively stable. People are eating about the same amount of food, drinking the same amount of wine, but, the volume of solar moving through a platform year over year is just, it's breathtaking. And I think testament to how when new products are brought to market and there's strong demand and customer adoption, being able to see the inner workings of the supply chains kind of like reworking themselves. It almost looks like, the brain's neurons like reconfiguring themselves to fire in like unique paths based on things that you discover and you like. We're seeing that kind of like interesting dynamic pattern within the supply chain ecosystem also emerge. So I thought that was a really cool inner workings of the world that we have visibility into.
No, that's true. You probably have some very unique insights into customer buying patterns right now.
Yeah, it's cool. The future is bright. based on the data that I see flowing through our platform, it is. I think we are heading towards a world of supply chain abundance, which emerges from more businesses existing in our economy than ever before, more interconnectivity between those businesses, a higher volume of goods and services, the pace of growth of new industries like solar being an example is accelerating with every new macro trend. We haven't quite yet sold into kind of like the AI chips world, but I'm sure that world is going through some utterly crazy exponential growth of supply chain constraints as demand has blown through the roof. So the future looks really bright. So I look at our data and it fills me with optimism, seeing what's possible and where the world is heading.
Well, and for all of those solar suppliers and installers, I hope the future is bright. Well, thank you so much, Sid, for joining us today and sharing a little bit more about Nuvo.
Thanks for having me, Ellen.
So when the rules of trade change fast, trust, speed, and clarity aren't luxuries. They're your competitive edge. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today. And to our listeners, if you found today's episode valuable, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you're interested in being a guest on our show, you can reach me at podcast@mebach.com at any time.